The presentation that I'm sharing today is part of my chapter for the edited volume that I'm co-editing with Tian Duhammer. And so this is still a work in progress, and I really appreciate all your feedback and suggestions. I'll share my screen because I forgot to do this. Because I remembered. Yes? Okay. Can you see it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. All right, let's start. So as my title indicates, I want to think through the concept of exposure in relation to cashiers. And I changed the title slightly to emphasize that the exposure goes beyond the body. I will talk about the nonfiction book, Les Tribulations d'une caissière, and its movie adaptation. The book, written by Anna Sam, is based on her 2007-2008 blog, which recounted her life as a cashier. The blog is no longer updated, but it is still available, and she does have a new website. The other text I'll discuss is Marie-Hélène Lafon's novel Nos Vies, and its precursor, the short story Gordana. And because of time, I'll only talk about 2 or 3 scenes from each text. When I speak of exposure, I want to focus on 2 aspects: the condition of being seen, made known, but also rendered vulnerable, and also the aspect that we perhaps most relate to nowadays, the condition of being subject to a virus. I'm also interested in how exposure intersects with the question of space, more specifically, how the fact of being confined, both physically and symbolically, contributes to making this exposure all the more inescapable and perhaps even deadly. Indeed, as we are currently living through a global pandemic, we have all noticed how vital frontline workers like cashiers are. They allow the rest of us to stay confined and fed. The pandemic has brought to the fore, as it has in other industries as well, the inequalities that sustain the machine. As this Libération cover puts it, les petits salaires de la peur, caissières, éboueurs, livreurs, les moins favorisés, véritables premiers de cordée quand les cadres sont confinés. What we will see in the 2 books in the film that I'll discuss shortly is perfectly summarized in the coverage of the reopening in France. Depuis le déconfinement, ils se sentent oubliés, exit les métiers essentiels à la survie de la nation, retour à la case départ d'avant coronavirus. No matter how much one wants to denounce the poor working conditions or make visible the lives of cashiers, in the end, there is often a retour à la case départ. Nothing has really changed. There is simply a turnover. Marie-Hélène Lafon's book ends with the departure of the cashier, Gordana, who is then replaced by la caissière ronde et brune, désormais vissée en casse-huit. The very nature of a cashier's work is indeed to be subject to both exposure and confinement in the public space. Françoise Carré and Chris Tilley point out in their study of the differences between French and US cashiers that French cashiers, unlike their counterparts, sit. They note that sitting reduces the space per cashier, allowing stores to maximize the number of cash registers. 50 cashier stations can operate simultaneously. Cashiers thus easily blend in with the background. In the 7-8 news report from March 2020, covering frontline workers during the first week of confinement in France at the beginning of the pandemic, we have a focus on the cashier behind a plexiglass screen. We see her wiping the keypad. And then there is a close-up on her face, which shows her emotions after a customer thanked her for her service. She seems speaking about the fear of going home and bringing the virus with her. And at the same time, she explains that she knows that she is needed. The news report, which will move to a different type of frontline worker, cuts from the close-up to her face to the work environment, where she completely disappears in the crowd and things go back to normal, a nameless cashier in a vast and fast-paced workspace. For there is also a speed requirement. Carré and Tilley note that French cashiers are more productive than their American counterparts. This is calculated in the target item scanning rates, as we can see in the table. This speed is what makes cashiers financially viable and profitable. However, as Anna Sam remarks in Les Tribulations d'une caissière, These constraints have dire effects on the bodies of cashiers. In a chapter titled Statistiquement Vôtre, Yours Statistically, she crunches some numbers and comes up with the following. While the productivity is high, the effects on the body are also clearly felt. Sam, who is 28 years old, feels 2.5 times her age. Est-ce que je ressemble à une bodybuildeuse? Non, pas du tout. J'ai souvent plus l'impression d'avoir 70 ans. Sam also points to the many skipped meals, the inability to leave one's post to go to the lavatory, possible tendinitis, backaches that turn into strained backs, the exposure to various viruses. But the answer is, le client est roi, c'est son droit de vous donner ces microbes. This positions cashiers as workers who have to endure whatever comes at them without complaining, and it contributes to their dehumanization. It is then not a surprise that the devaluation of this profession is closely linked to the general devaluation of women's labor. In France, nearly all retail cashiers or checkout operators are women. 95% in 2010, 90% in 2018. And if we look at the statistics for a few other countries, although the numbers are lower, we can see that women still make up the great majority of cashiers. This fact is quite important, for it certainly influences how we talk about the profession, and it absolutely plays a role in how cashiers are portrayed in various cultural productions. I'd also like to point out that unlike for some professions predominantly occupied by women, being a cashier is a relatively stable job. We cannot speak of cashiers in the same way that we speak of cleaning ladies or nannies who often work precariously without a contract, without benefits, and can be dismissed overnight. However, if we look at the way that cashiers are perceived in contemporary society and consider how the profession is often used as a cautionary tale, I'd like to argue that they occupy a precarious social space and a literary one, very much like cleaning ladies or nannies. Tu finiras caissière is a common threat leveled by French parents at their children to ensure that they comply and do their homework. It is a sentence one finds in Anna Sam's blog, in her book. It is a sentence that is featured in the film adaptation. It is a cashier's very first interaction with a client 5 minutes into the film. And it is also prominently used in the trailer for the movie. And here you see a screen capture that is included in the French press kit. The sentence is also used in satirical cartoons as punchlines. It is something that people have heard over and over, and it can be used to sell movies or tell-all books like Sam's in 2008, or more recently, the book by Cynthia Renou, which came out in May 2020. As Sam denounces in her book, often cashiers are treated as if they were barely human, transparent, invisible, robots, stupid, and she does use ableist language to make the point that cashiers are viewed as diminished, which is also an issue in itself. The qualifier idiot comes again and again in this book because the work is assumed to not be intellectually demanding. And I'd like to suggest that this common type of thinking, that cashiers have nothing between their ears or rien dans la tête, contributes to a redoubled scrutiny of their appearance when it comes to their fictional representations. For this is also a side effect of the job. Sam notes in a chapter dedicated to this question, Je suis dans le regret de vous rappeler que la caissière, même derrière sa caisse, doit pouvoir être immédiatement identifiée par le client comme étant bien une caissière. Sam goes on detailing the various possible uniforms, the tenue dite clown or tenue dite mémé that cashiers are forced to wear. These all contribute to telling the client visually in which store they are shopping. Rather than being fully realized persons, they become a sign. Cashiers are not only confined to a small space, working in difficult conditions, subjected to contempt from shoppers, or literally exposed to viruses. They are also meant to be interchangeable. They embody a function, and it matters little to the shopper who sits behind the register. Cashiers become blank canvases onto which shoppers or authors or directors can project their fantasies or work out their aggression or reveal their racism, as we will later see. Marie-Hélène Lafon's work. Oops. Okay. Marie-Hélène Lafon's Gordana, the cashier in both the short story and the novel Nos vies, is subjected to an exaggerated attention to her body, which results in an almost farcical depiction, if it weren't so grating. Gordana is described as a set of overwhelming body parts that can be fantasized upon and become a repository for the narrator's projections rather than Gordana's interiority. And I could spend the remainder of our time simply listing all the ways that Gordana is described. Every page she appears on has a reference to her body. But here are a few choice citations. Son cou, pièce maîtresse d'un corps qui ne manque pas d'atouts canoniques. Les cuissons longues, minces, galbées, d'un jet dru. Et que dire des seins? Ils abondent, ils échappent à l'entendement, n'ont aucun respect ni aucune éducation. Le corps de Gordana, sa voix, son accent, son prénom, son maintien viennent de loin. Gordana se propulse plus qu'elle ne marche. Elle ahane à la sauvage, tout son corps ploie, plonge. It gets even worse when the narrator notices other cashiers and proceeds along the same lines of characterization and adds a dose of racism. Les autres qui se ressemblent toutes ont l'air de venir du même endroit du monde, ni l'Afrique noire, ni le Maghreb, ni l'Asie, je dirais l'Indonésie ou l'Inde ou les Philippines. Elles sont menues et vives, les mêmes peaux sombres et lisses, des mains petites et de petits pieds. Leurs cheveux sont longs, elles sont très disponibles pour la clientèle, elles se mettent en quatre. Et Gordana est au milieu d'elles comme un grand corps blanc, jaune, rêche, raide et étranger. While Lafon's narrator gets to reminisce about her childhood, her past, her friends, for Gordana and the other nameless cashier, all we get are parts, and often body parts. The rest is implied or fantasized. Niall Martley, which is the illustrator for the short story, echoed this visually in her illustration for Gordana, which was published prior to the novel, by cutting up the cashier's body parts. We thus become even more aware that the zooming in on the individual body parts takes away from the person as a whole. There is so much missing in this portrayal. We're not privy to who Gordana actually is. And this is quite different from Martley's other work. And here are some samples of other paintings. For Lafon's narrator, Gordana is somewhere from l'Est de l'Est. And so she imagines a life for her that relies on stereotypes and cliches about poor, undefined Eastern European countries. Gordana and her nameless colleagues are hypervisible in Lafon's imaginary, all the while remaining quite invisible. In the same vein of these visual representations, I'd also like to go back to Anna Sam's book and mention that it was translated into more than 20 languages. And it is interesting to see how the different covers contribute to this visible invisibility. A couple French editions feature empty shopping carts. The focus is not on the cashier, but rather imply a client about to start their shopping. When the cashier is present, it is merely as a hand on a register. The covers for the translations follow roughly the same pattern. Many empty shopping carts, some have baskets or paper bags, and two feature clients waiting. The rest of the translations each feature a cartoon-like cashier who looks inviting or overwhelmed, as if they couldn't decide, or they simply focus on certain choice body parts, the mouth, the legs. The supermarket cashier, who works in a place that thrives on repackaging overconsumption into necessity or essentials, is also someone that can be cut up and neatly packaged for literary consumption. And when the story is further packaged into a film, it becomes even more palatable and entertaining. The poster features the main actress in a shopping cart, which Anna Sam on her blog likens to the poster for Bridget Jones's Diary. And this clearly positions the film as a fun, romantic Christmas comedy. Because Sam's book does not have a plot, so to say, let alone a romantic subplot, the film fills in the blanks in very problematic ways. In an interview included in the press kit, the director, Pierre Rambaldi, explains his vision. J'avais envie de camper un personnage romantique, solaire, lumineux, plongé dans cet univers-là. C'est totalement subjectif, mais je sentais qu'il me fallait une jeune comédienne blonde, susceptible d'être crédible dans les deux dimensions du film, la comédie romantique et la comédie sociale. In other words, for him, it means a Black actress would not be believable as the main character in this Christmas romantic comedy tackling social issues. And this invisibility in French cinema is exactly what has been denounced by 16 Black French actresses in the volume edited by Aïssa Maïga, Noir n'est pas mon métier. As Maïga notes in her introduction, nous avons peu d'opportunités intéressantes pour des rôles de premier plan. Notre présence dans les films français est encore trop souvent due à la nécessité incontournable ou anecdotique d'avoir un personnage noir. Noir n'est pas mon métier. In this film, there are 4 main characters. Solveig, who is the anonymous blogger and main character. Marie, an undercover investigative reporter who is trying to unmask the blogger. She's also white. And then there are 2 other cashiers, Leila and Sandy, who are literally there to provide color. Sandy is Black, Leila is of Maghrebi descent. And screenwriter Michel Sixic describes them in the following terms. Sans parler de Sandy et de Leila en caissière haute en couleur. Pour les caissières, ce n'était pas difficile. Le mélange black-blanc-beurre est celui observé au poste des caissières de supermarché. Il me semblait juste de traduire cette réalité-là. Leila and Sandy are supporting characters. They prop up the plot, but they are also supporting in the French sense of the word, in that they endure what is thrown at them while figuring as a symbolic embodiment of La France Black-Blanc-Beurre. Besides being symbols of multicultural France, Sandy and Leila are not fully formed characters. They merely embody stereotypes and cliches. Sandy's story can be summarized in the following way. She cleans a fast food restaurant before coming to work at the supermarket to make ends meet. For a bourgeois family after work is constantly used as comic relief because of her antics and her français des cités. She's loud and belligerent and gets fired. And the only bit of personal news is that she finds out she's pregnant shortly before getting fired. A party at Leila's house at the end of the movie will allow Solveig to confront Marie about writing the article that reveals her identity. Leila and Sandy thus figure as racialized bodies, as tokens of French diversity, but they are not given any real agency or interiority. In a scene where Solveig gets insulted and next to her Leila gets insulted by another client, only Solveig is able to show that she is more than une caissière. A sympathetic client tells her, La vulgarité est un crime, mademoiselle. All vulgarity is crime. And Solveig responds, Oscar Wilde. The client is surprised, but Solveig gets to show off her literary knowledge, while Leila has to bear the racist attitude of the client and can only turn her back on him. There's no redemption, no opportunity to shine, no opportunity to talk back. This is reserved only for Solveig, who is the one who pens a social critique through her blog. She's the one who gets swept off her feet by Prince Charming, literally, and she ends up publishing a bestseller. It certainly does not come as a surprise to read in Firmin Richard's essay in Noir n'est pas mon métier that her work as a Black actress is devalued. Dans une comédie à succès dans laquelle j'ai tourné récemment, nous étions 4 comédiennes principales. J'ai appris que l'une d'entre elles, et je ne parle pas de l'actrice vedette, était payée 5 fois mieux que moi pour un nombre de jours de tournage équivalent. While Richard does not give the title of the film, it seems quite likely that it is Les Tribulations d'une caissière. The question of who gets to embody what role and for what reason, and who is deemed to be believable, goes beyond representation. It also directly affects remuneration. To conclude, it is a very different experience to read a book like Anna Sam's, who shares her own experience and reflections, compared to seeing the film adaptation or reading a book like Marie-Hélène Lafon's. Sam allows the reader to step into the world of cashiers by using vous in a way that makes it similar to a choose-your-own-adventure type of book, or livre dont vous êtes le héros. Bienvenue dans la belle famille de la grande distribution. Vous voici donc devenu caissière, that's how she starts off. As such, readers are subjected to the clients like Sam. They experience it with an insider view, but at the same time, they're able to retain their individuality and their humanity. However, the end of the book suggests that there is no real remedy to the exposure of the job. There is no way past a very likely mistreatment by both management and clients. The only way out seems to be by an abandonment of the profession. Alors, vous avez toujours envie d'être caissière? C'est toujours le métier de votre vie? Non? Je m'en doutais. Mais vous n'avez pas le choix? Oui, je m'en doutais aussi. Bon courage quand même. Et puis, si ça va vraiment pas, faites comme moi, écrivez un livre. Okay.
That was brilliant. Thank you very much, Sonja. Thank you. We're going to move straight on to our next speaker, if that's okay, and we'll have questions at the end. So if you've got any questions now for Sonja and you're worried about forgetting them, you can put them in the chat and we can come back to them. But for now, we're going to move on to Nadia Terki, who's from Durham University. So she is a fourth-year PhD student in the Department of English Studies. She has a master's degree in language and culture of English-speaking countries and media, and her PhD thesis focuses on the literary representations of political violence and the precursory relation between anarchism and contemporary terrorism. So Nadia's paper today is titled Gender and Terrorism, the Role of Women Within Radical Movements. Thank you, Nadia.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Thank you for this amazing series, and thank you for turning up as well for our presentations. And thank you, Sonja, as well. Your presentation was really amazing. So as the title suggests, my presentation today, I'll try to give an idea of how women are presented in relation to terrorist movements or, radical movements. I'll give the example of Home Fire, which is a novel by Kamila Shamsi. It was published in 2017. It's quite a recent novel. So Home Fire is a captivating novel that is based on Sophocles' Antigone, written in or before 441 BC. It was published in 2017, like I said. Shamsi received the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2018 for that same novel. It did not lack references and praise in the immediate period following its publication. Numerous newspapers, journals, and interviews with the author affirmed the magnificence of the novel and its ingenuity in the ways it adopts an ancient play into the contemporary times and context, and how it reflects on the structure of terrorism and its contemporary phase. Home Fire invites us to have a deep, skeptical vision of the implication of political violence within family and national frames. One of the intricate reflections of Home Fire is women and terrorism and the involvement of females in political violence. Women within the sphere of terrorism is not an exclusive feature of fundamentalism. It has been part of the process for as long as political violence has existed, in different forms and degrees. Shamsi's Anika is one of the main characters in Home Fire, is the female character who stands for the participation of women in political violence. The novel replicates an atmosphere that stimulates female terrorism. The novel in itself is set in the 21st century. However, it sends us back to anarchism, the period of what is considered as the earliest precursor of fundamentalism. Gender and terrorism is not at the center of the terrorism discussion as a whole, but there is still a considerable scholarship exploring the presence of women in different movements of political violence. Studies on women and terrorism tend to focus efforts on explaining the reasons behind the presence of women in radical movements, such as fundamentalism and anarchism. Different links are drawn between the emotional capacities of women and their action within the sphere of terrorism. Yet there is a significant lack of consideration to the rationale and the context of women's participation in terrorism. So within the frame of fundamentalism, so within the frame of fundamentalism, women's radical movements in political violence followed similar arrangements. The problematic of their involvement was more about what side of the fight they could access than their actual participation. The Western media particularly represent Arab female radicals in ways that question their mental conditions and their political consciousness. Furthermore, their actions are explained in matters of mental and emotional instability. Similar to the effects of the patriarchal structure of the Russian society and the role of women radicals, it is the gap between what women should signify and, in both cases, the representation as well as the justification of female radicals as part of a revolutionary movement based on violence. it prompts an alien vision towards those women. McNeill, who conducted his research on 369 female Russian radicals, concludes that the equality was mostly achieved when it came to murder. In a contemporary context, most studies take the cases of the Palestinians, the Chechen, and the Tamil women as examples for the roles and motivations behind their participation in violent movements. Within that same ideological formation of women and anarchism, contemporary radical women faced the same assumptions of absence of agency. Joran Schweitzen, who's from the former Israeli Defense Force informant, writes that Palestinian women bombers are definitely not leaders of their organizations, but rather serve as pawns and sacrificial lambs, claiming that women bombers did not have control over their social agency and activism. Mia Bloom also builds up her argument on the absence of real woman agency within radical movements, due to the patriarchal society structure of their communities, as well as the social stigma concerning widows and victims of rape. The category of women, according to her, tend to be marginalized and deprived of their dignity. Therefore, they are easily recruited as suicide bombers, as a way to supposedly be celebrated. There is a main issue in relation to these assumptions, and more importantly, generalizations around the participation of women in violent movement. There is a constant association of terrorist women with their vulnerability and sensitivity and the prevalence of their emotions over their rational logic. Hence, their actions, be it in the context of anarchism or fundamentalism, are always considered within the frame of weakness and submission rather than their own will and conviction. Rajan Julie argues that the portrayal of women terrorists is non-reflective of reality, in that a woman's execution of an attack, even with determination and out of her own record, and even without the consent of men, if her own rebel unit cannot be interpreted as evidence of her full and free agency, regardless of what she has stated. Assuming the passivity of women and their non-awareness of what they embark in is an outcome of the patriarchal apparatus, and at the same time, it discredits women themselves, but most importantly, the movements they are affiliated to. Anika, the pseudo-radical women in Home Fire, acted out of love, rage, anger, and certainly out of her own conviction. Furthermore, the pressure of the patriarchal society is not relevant in her case. First, because she lives in Britain, and second, because her fatherly authority that could have represented the patriarchy is absent. After she discovers that her twin brother, Pervez, joined ISIS and wanted to get back to the UK, she's determined to undertake the mission of bringing him back. Her actions are far from being the result of brainwashing, submission, or social recognition. When asked by the SO1 Specialist Protection Officer why she was with Eamon, he's the son of the Home Secretary. Her answer conveys her conviction about wanting him to help her bring Pervez home. She says, quote, "What would you stop at to help the people you love the most?" Her decision to die trying to bring the body of her brother back to the UK at the end of the novel is the outcome of her struggle for her brother. Some scholars' argument that women act under pressure is true. However, it is not the pressure of society or men. It is the pressure of her anger and determination to do whatever it takes to save Pervez. She acted against the will of her sister, her family, and above all, her country. In fact, she defies not only social stigmas, but also political agendas. Anika's love for her brother and her inclination to do whatever it takes to bring his dead body speaks to a larger political atmosphere. One of the most marking moments of the novel is the one set in the park where Anika is reunited with her body of her brother. It was set in Pakistan. It is a major moment where all the fragments of the novel come together due to the live streaming of the theatrical atmosphere. Cara Matlone, who is the Home Secretary, and his colleagues, Isma, the sister of Anika, and Eamon, are all watching Anika mourn her brother in front of the cameras, She then moves addressing Lone in what I think reflects one of the central problematics surrounding terrorism, be it Islamic fundamentalism or anarchism. So she says to the Home Secretary through the camera, in the stories of wicked tyrants, men and women are punished with exile, bodies are kept far from their families, their heads impaled on spikes, their corpses thrown into unmarked graves. All these things happen according to the law, but not according to justice. I am here to ask for justice. I appeal to the Prime Minister. Let me take my brother home. End of the quote. Lone's reaction, he says, she was just a silly girl, is, in my opinion, exaggerated and certainly undermining of Anika's struggle, sorrow, and agency as a female fighting for the right to bury her brother in the country he belongs to. To consider Anika's mission as some silly business brings us back to the political and social assumption that surround the women's involvement in political violence. The Home Secretary again qualifies Anika of silliness, madness. Newspapers use the terms of evil, slag, tourist spawn, and enemy of Britain to describe her and her decision to try and bring back the body of her brother. Profiling Anika of madness revokes all her decision and action from the moment she comes to know that her brother wants to be back to the UK. Furthermore, it questions her moral ability to make rational decisions. This profiling is one that is used to disqualify and undermine the role of women in anarchism and Islamist fundamentalism. Beaumont contends that Hezbollah, quote, Hezbollah specifically deployed women whose moral caliber was questionable, end of quote, denying female radicals their moral and cognitive abilities to represent their own position vis-a-vis their choices to join violent movements. Indeed, assumptions in collective narratives about female radicals as being not thinking objects with their own political motivation and interests. There is the recurrent problematic of imprisoning females within limited social and cultural frames that negate their existence as dependent and rational individuals with the ability of exercising their agency within the different frames of society. Anika indeed is not interested in being suicide bomber or even an active radical female. It is only her devotion and love to her twin brother that motivated her to stand up to a powerful government. Although her motivation may seem to be putting her back into the social and cultural assumption about female role, it only reveals the overlap between social and political spheres within political violence. Shamsi, through her character, Anika, sheds light on the social and human side behind violent movements, not in the aim of legitimizing them, but to deepen and enhance our understanding of the different paradigms surrounding it. Moreover, the narrative contains a covert story about cultural and political norms that frame their gendered agencies. In the case of the Tamil female who are involved in the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, who's said to be a terrorist organization, their agency is put within the frame of traditional patriarchal conception of the role of women within society. Therefore, they are placed within the social sphere. Quote, she must have been a loving daughter to her parents, a loving sister to her siblings, and one day could have been a loving wife and mother. Yet her life was robbed by a megalomaniac who hates everyone but himself. This Tamil woman was ordered to kill another Tamil man by blasting herself to bring liberation to her race, who fooled him. On a primary level, there is a fundamental issue in asserting that women's role and centrality within social domain. However, there is a major problematic in the limitation of her role to the social compass, as well as the deflating interpretation of her political activism. In fact, the constant proliferation of women as incapable of political cognition and engagement promotes the idea that their decisions are not fully informed and dismiss their own political statements. The limited readings of women's role within revolutionary groups leads to the objectification of women and endorses ulterior political agencies. Home Fire offers a pervasive perspective about women's engagement in political violence. The surface story is indeed about a sister who fights to bring back her brother. she is motivated by her love to her twin and her feeling of duty towards him, and the need to save him after his realization that there is no such a thing as a just Islamic caliphate. Her determination is not weakened even after his death, and she insisted on burying him next to their mother. She stood against the British government despite the attempts of her sister to prevent her. The Pakistani High Commissioner compares Anika's love to Pervez to the Pakistani folktale of Layla and Majnun, which is about the grief of the lover upon the loss of the beloved, who wanders in the desert in madness. In Home Fire, the story is, however, reversed. It is Anika who runs grief-crazed through the desert in search of her love. The reversed role serves the rehabilitation of women's agencies. Again, the struggle of Anika is read within the limits of brotherly love. However, her experience stands for the larger involvement of women in political violence as a result of personal conviction and belief in their mission, regardless of the cultural and social stigmatization surrounding them. Anika is only the shell part of the story. The more significant part lies in the coverts inside of the shell. Anika is the romantic heroine, offers an opportunity to reflect on women's role within political violence, regardless of the social and cultural limitation. The character of Anika speaks to personalities that defy the traditional conception of women's agency. Among the aspect of that defiance is the equation of the maternal to the nation, which parallels women's ability to sacrifice for her convictions to men's political agency. The ability to sacrifice for her family translates to her ability to sacrifice for her country in a time of crisis. In that context, the Palestinian women taking part in the struggle for a separate Palestinian state suffer personal losses in addition to the overall state of war. Therefore, their decisions to join violent movements is an expression of outrage and anger rather than being the result of social pressure. Layla Khalid, a member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, mostly known for the hijacking of the TWA 840 in 1996, she argues that Palestinian women, quote, are under attack. Women are ready to sacrifice themselves for the national struggle, for the respect of just right, end of quote. Shamsi through Anika speaks of those women who sacrifice their lives and defy the traditional social construction that surround the agency of women that is supposedly limited to nurturing and caring for their children and homes. Home Fire does not simply tell the story sorry, I lost my thread there. Tell the story of the brother victim whose sister attempted to save. It contains a deeper sense of political agency of women and the motivations behind it. Anika, through her journey to repatriate the body of her brother, managed to position herself at the center of the world's attention and placed the Home Secretary in a complicated and embarrassing situation. There is a tendency to depoliticize women due to patriarchal oppressive structures of society that makes them non-suitable for a movement that aims at change in society. The denial of women's role within the frame of revolutions and political violence voices the intersection of the social and the political spheres. A conception that Shamsi's narrative represents through positioning Anika at the center of the social and the political paradigms that marginalize women and reduces their agencies and activism. Karamat alone reduces Anika to a silly girl and therefore depriving her action of any significance and sense of being. The Home Secretary planned to make the story about Pervez, quote, the British citizen who had turned his back on his nation and in favor of a place of crucifixion, beheadings, floggings, head on spikes, child soldiers, slavery, and rape, end of quote, instead of making it about his sister who fights against the odds of the British government and Home Secretary for a grave for her brother. The girl whose status was reduced to madness, a sad child raised to an enemy. Indeed, Anika, contrary to how the media portrayed her and her brother as a traitor to her country, is a symbol of courage and resolution in the midst of national disapproval and condemnation. a common faith that she shares with women whose agency as revolutionaries and political activists, whose status quo is degraded. Thank you. Thanks. That's it.
Thank you so much, Nadia. That was really
Thank you.
And thank you, Sonja. So please fire away any questions into the chat box. Give me a wave. I think I'm going to kick start while we wait for some questions to come in. I found both presentations absolutely fantastic, and I've learned so much this morning already. But I thought what stood out to me and what they tied in really well in terms of agency. And I wonder if both of you could maybe talk a little bit more about this, because what I found very interesting was that both texts you were talking about the sort of difficulty of agency, but I was wondering in terms of sort of narrative voice, do you think the literature and the text, I should say text because we've got films as well, sort of provide this sense of agency? Do they have first person narrations? Do they center, or are they actually removing the agency? How does narrative voice sort of intercept with the agency for both of you?
Okay, I'll go first. I think for Home Fire, the way the novel is structured is in sections, so every character has their own section. As for the narrative voice of Anika, I think in that regard, she's always referred to by other characters. So the way the story is told, it's not a story she tells herself. So she does not, as such, she does not tell her own experiences. There is, so she's always referred to as Anika or her experiences or her brother. There is no such a thing as her I. The I is not there. So in that regard as well, I think her agency is even further reduced because she's not even given the opportunity of telling her own story, which I think is really relevant in the context, because for all those women who do take part in radical movements, they don't have the opportunity to represent themselves or to actually justify their actions or to give their own opinion about their own vision of whatever they take part in. So indeed, there is a significant issue in that regard as well.
In the case of Nos vies, the book by Marie-Hélène Lafon, it is a first-person narration, but it is the narrator who observes the cashier, and she's always described as Elle, or the other cashiers that don't even have a name are Elle in the plural. So you really don't have any agency from the cashier, the figure of the cashier, and it's really it is disturbing as one is reading it, in that there is just so much projected, and there is very little there's very little insight in what actually goes on inside. Those are all assumptions that the narrator makes based on her shopping. So it's really the time that she goes to check out. This is the time that she uses to fantasize and imagine the cashier's life. When you look at Anna Sam's book, which is nonfiction, in which she, based on the blog in which she tells her own story, you have here the agency of the cashier. What is interesting is that it really only becomes available to us through this book or through the blog, and so there's a difference between her writing the blog and then her writing the book. Even though she repackages some of her blog posts, it really gains traction. It becomes a film because it went through the proper literary channels. It is published with stock. So I think it falls into the same category as narratives or testimonies by cleaning ladies or by nannies that barely have a voice while they're at work, or while they're doing the work, but the moment that they start writing about it and then suddenly become authors, then the agency comes with also the literary consecration. So what it would be interesting to analyze is the comments on the blog. So there's a lot of cashiers who are expressing what they are going through, and so you can see it in that little community. So.
Thank you both so much for that. I don't think we've got any more questions at the moment, so I'll just keep going. I'm really interested, Sonja, because I look at diaries from cleaners, and I just wondered whether you found, when you're looking at sort of the caissier, whether there is this idea of using comedy to express, because you talked a little bit about this sort of comic genre, and I thought it was really interesting because in some of these diaries from cleaners, we use comedy in terms of expressing sort of really, as comedy is used sometimes in films, obviously, to discuss really harsh conditions, to discuss the realities of things, whether you found that comedy is also used by the caissier as well.
Yeah, there's so Anna Sam's book is really funny. She tries to take everything with a dose of humor. As she explained on her blog, following the publication of the book, that she wasn't writing this tell-all to denounce necessarily anything or to change. She was just expressing her daily life. So it wasn't, even though the blog was called Caissière nos futurs, it wasn't meant at first as a way to call out the industry. But so humor is definitely used. What I thinking about cleaners as well, I think it's interesting that there's this fine line between laughing with and laughing at, and so the humor can at times become, a little sad, because you are laughing at the situation, and then it becomes easy to forget that this is actually happening to someone's life on a daily basis. I think that though that Sam in her book and her blog does a much better job than the film adaptation, which is trying to not only do a comedy, but like a romantic comedy. And so it becomes quite farcical and quite cliche, of the poor worker who meets Prince Charming and lives happily ever after and becomes a best-selling author. And it's just, then it takes away from the critique, perhaps, of the industry.
And do you find that that when we're talking about laughing at or laughing with, that it's actually the treatment from the customers, or do you think that, like, when they talk about comments, it's actually against their sort of patron, their bosses as well? Because I haven't read the text, but they seem really, really interesting. Just wondering, like, on terms of sort of employee-employer relationship.
There's a few chapters where she describes different types of customers, and so you can laugh at the customers, but then there's also these moments where they are made to be the laughing stock, where you can see in the film that they have to wear these crazy costumes to sell honey or to sell some other, so yes, it is funny, but then it becomes funny because the cashier is put in a really disturbing situation. There's a whole chapter about how to use the lavatory. What do? You have to call la caisse centrale. You have to ask someone. So it becomes it is funny, but then you also you have to keep reminding yourself as a reader that this is actually terrible, and then you're laughing because, otherwise you would cry.
That's brilliant. Thank you both so much Jess, really great question about agency. That was one of my questions as well. So we have a question here from Amelina Damley for Sonja. And Amelina's asked us to read this out. She says, wonderful seminar. Thank you to both speakers for your thought-provoking presentations. Thanks to Sonja for reflecting on her research in light of the frontline work of the cashier in the present circumstances. Absolutely. So Amelina is interested in the protective barriers that we're now seeing everywhere in shops. The screen creates an interesting way of regarding the cashier. Sorry, I think I'm doing like a hybrid French-English pronunciation there. Cashier. And I wondered whether Sonja had any thoughts on the power relations that might be emphasised here and how these might accentuate some of the themes already present in her research. Thank you, Amelina. That's a great question.
I hadn't thought much about the protective barriers as a different way of looking at it, but if I think of this news report where you see it, the cashier's face becomes blurred, so as much as it is protecting her and protecting the shopper, there is I think maybe one runs the risk again to see these workers as less than human beings, and it's just a robot that will give you back your change or and get you on your way. I think too that what cashiers have complained after the reopening was that people stopped using, so following safety guidelines, that there's a lot of reluctance to protect the cashier in a sense. So there is definitely something to be looked further. I don't really have a good answer, but I thank you for this. I think it is quite important to see how it would affect the power relation between cashier and worker.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sonja, and thank you, Amelina. We have another question for Sonja from Elise, if that's okay. So she asks, are you also considering the invisibility/disappearance of cashier because of self-service checkouts? Really interesting question. Also, for further representations of cashier in contemporary literature, I'm wondering if you consider looking at Annie Ernaux's text, so Regarde la lumière, mon amour, but also The End of Laplace. And Elise says she has to attend online training session at 11 a.m. So good luck with that. But thank you for your question, Elise. I'll pass over to Sonja.
Yes, thank you. There is, so yeah, the end of Laplace, you have this interesting moment where Annie Ernaux comes upon a former student, I believe, and who's a cashier, and then she sees herself as potentially being in that same place if she hadn't gone on and done further studies and become an author. I think that this aspect is also quite interesting in that to go back to what I was saying before, you find out about the lives of cashiers after they are no longer cashiers, or in Anna Sam's blog, you still have the blog, but then immediately she becomes an author, and she gets to continue being an author. She published a novel recently. So with Annie Ernaux, looking back at what could have happened, again plays into this idea that, I'm so sorry, I need to plays into this idea that you can only speak once you're not in that place. And but I haven't looked at Regarde les lumières, mon amour. So that'd be very interesting. At other to add to other representation in contemporary literature, there's this short sentence in Fatou Diom's La Préférence Nationale, which is a novel where the narrator is is applying for a tutoring job, and the woman who meets with her is a cashier, is a white cashier, and Fatou Diom's narrator is a black woman and an immigrant, and she gets told by the cashier that she will not hire her because she doesn't want to ruin the education of her child. And then the narrator replies, if you had as much in your head, so si vous aviez autant dans la tête as I do, you wouldn't be a cashier. So you have this aspect of being able to use cashier as an insult and talk back. And obviously in Fatou Diom's story, it is warranted. It is warranted. She is being diminished by the cashier, and this is an easy way to hurt her back, or to settle the debate of who is educated and who is not. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sonja. I've got a question for Nadia, because what I was really interested in is I've read quite a lot on women sort of violating normal roles, and Lisa Downing's got a fantastic book on this to do with women that are killers and serial killers, and this idea of you're violating sort of the passive role, etc. And what I found really interesting was that you mentioned that the women in the text and the women that you're like studying, actually by sort of going against these sort of roles that they should be violating, this role of a woman, that they're still seen as what you said was sort of still weakness and submission. And I thought you could just, if you don't mind, like just expand on that and say like how through sort of being part of such radical political violence, they're actually not seen as we sort of look at, like in those texts, women killers violating their roles, that actually this is still submission.
Yes, I think because so there's always this idea that you see, it's like if you try and do something differently, it means that you find it difficult to accept whatever there is. So the problematic of not fitting into the social, into the normal profiling of women and what they should be, what they should signify, it is regarded as a weakness because you have those women have a difficulty and they find it difficult to fit into those profiles. So the fact of women not accepting the idea of being passive, of being degraded, of being without any agency is regarded as a weakness in itself, because the fact that these women cannot accept the idea of nurturing, the idea of being just mothers or sisters or wives is in fact in a way contributes to making their status even more degraded, because they even when they try to they adhere to those groups, terrorist groups said, they are regarded as aliens. It's either you are alien or you're weak. So there is no way you could fit into this ideal profile where you're a woman who's nurturing, who's a wife, who's a sister and a mother, and at the same time having this amazing agency. So I think there is a serious problem in admitting that women do have the choice of being or fitting into whatever profile they want to fit in. So the weakness problem always comes up because first there is a patriarchal society and there is these normalized profiles that to which if you don't fit or if you don't belong to those profiles, then there is a problem with you again. So the problem is not the profile, but the women. And if you don't fit into that profile, it means that there is some sort of weakness that is stopping you. Yeah, I hope that makes sense.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting.
I had a question for Nadia. I was wondering about mourning as a political act, and grief as and how that might help us think about the division between the emotion, the passion, the very weak aspects that one might attribute to like feeling something, but mourning, how it can be also used as what drives change or resistance.
Yes, if I do get what you mean, is there is in the novel there is this section where they describe the whole scene of Anika, the main character, mourning the death of her brother. So again, it brings us back to this idea of profiling. So if let's say we do consider mourning and crying and sadness as some sort of a sign of weakness, I think in that case, in Anika's case, it was more a show. It was more an expression of her grief, of her anger, and I think it also expresses the motivation of whatever she has done to try and bring back the body of her brother to the UK. So I think indeed mourning can be considered as some sort of political expression of disagreement, of rebellion as well, of non-acceptance of whatever is going on. But generally, I think that mourning is rather considered as a sign of weakness, especially when related to women's agency. But I think specifically in this novel, there is that scene is a wonderful scene of I think it's more in that specific moment. It's more an expression of anger, in expression of disbelief, and also some sort of because I think Anika is not angry because she did not try or because she did not have the motivation. It's because there was so much around her. There was like the social and political situations and political atmospheres that did prevent her from achieving her goal. So I think it was more of that than actually mourning the death of her brother. There is this expression of deep anger at not being able to do what she wanted to do at the beginning. Yeah, but again, the reaction of those who were watching her was just like describing her as a silly girl, as you know. So it's related to madness rather than to anger. So there's like because when she was mourning, there was this howling sound as if it was wind blowing. It was quite a strong scene. So instead of linking it to her strength, to her anger, to her motivation, it was linked to some sort of madness or alien. It was an alien attribution rather than anything else.
Thank you so much, Nadia. It was really clear. I really understood what you were saying there. Dominique has put, thank you both for, oh my gosh, I got my teeth in. Thank you both so much for great papers. There's also an interesting scene between Younes, Rose and Delphine, who is now a cassier in Cleves in La Mer à l'Envers, as you probably know, Sonja, which involves questions of in brackets, visibility, class and race. I really enjoyed your paper. Many thanks. Then another question from Benjamin for Sonja. I was fascinated by your exploration of exposure and oppression and the place of the body within this Elle n'habite pas son corps, elle se prête. Knowing that you've worked a lot on Dariusk, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry for pronunciation, and have written in particular on Tribulations, sorry, I was wondering how you would compare the text you've talked about today with Tribulations, I'm so sorry, and its own representations of labour, exposure and exploitation. In Tribulations, how do you feel the narrator's fantastical transformation in relation to labour, and how is the question of corporeal transformation present in the text you analysed today?
Thank you, Ben. I hadn't thought about the link between truisme and the caissière, but it makes a lot of sense since she does work in a perfume shop and is, in a way, one could say, a saleswoman or a type of caissière. The question of so corporeal transformation. Apart from the deterioration of the body, I think that this is what's most striking, is that the more one works, the harder it is. I think what to me was very interesting is to read the social scientists' reports on productivity, on how the space in a supermarket is designed, where it might seem like it is for the good of the cashier. So, for example, the difference between sitting and standing, you would think that sitting is better for you or is less tiresome, but then you find out that it is just to maximize space, and that the cashier has also to do a lot of sitting and standing, which brings up a whole lot of problems that one may not have in just standing. So the different types of movements. So I think the main aspect of transformation is really based on the labor and the exploitation of the body. In the film, we have this little reference to Sandy's character who gained 17 kilos. Due to her work and the stress. So you also have you have this this aspect of something that that you go through at work that directly affects how your body will respond to it. I'm looking still about. In the case of Gordana, de nos vies, elle n'habite pas son corps, elle se prête. There's not necessarily a transformation throughout the novel where you see Gordana changing, but there is definitely a big focus on how her body is perceived by the narrator and by the client. Gordana has a disability that Lafon's narrator really focuses on in awful ways, and I didn't have time to talk about this, but this is something that I want to explore more. I don't have an answer quite yet, but I will very soon. But thank you for that question.
Well, I want to take this opportunity to thank both our speakers today for such fantastic papers. It's been brilliant, and it's just been the best finish to our triad of themes. So thank you all for attending. I want to take this moment now to pass on the baton, as it were, to Benjamin and Rebecca, who are going to, I think it's Rebecca that's going to give us a quick run through as to what the next bits of excitement we've got in their seminar series. So I'm going to hand over to Rebecca now. Thank you so much for attending today, and take it from there, Rebecca. You can sell it to us.
I think Ben's here as well. He might be hiding though behind. Wait, are you there, Ben? Still? Might be making a cup of tea. I don't know. Right. So Ben, do you want to start with explaining the seminar series and the theme, and then I'll talk a bit about the first one that we're both doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Is my mic's on now? Is it? So our lecture series, our seminar series is called Contemporary Women's Writing and the Medical Humanities. So this basically just explores how contemporary women writers, be that across fiction, philosophy, poetry, comics, autobiography, autofiction, and many other genres, engage with medical research and medical practice. So it's a kind of very broad exploration of bringing together the medical humanities and contemporary women's writing. And throughout the course of our series, we aim to be as interdisciplinary as possible and really bring together these disciplines, and also have kind of medical practitioners and medical researchers responding to the papers and giving their own papers as well. So the seminar series will be held in English, but as with Jessica and Jemima's series, the texts and materials studied can be from any original language but as long as they're kind of spoken about in English translation. And the deadline for abstracts is this Friday, the 4th of September. And yeah, I think that's about it. So we look forward to getting your abstracts for that. And then I'll pass over to Becky with news of the first seminar.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Yeah, explained it much better than I could. So our first one, our first seminar, Ben and I will be taking the lead on that. That's on the 22nd of September. That's what was that? Is that a Tuesday? I should have looked this up. Anyway, it's the 22nd of September. It starts at 5:30. It goes on till 7 p.m. and we're hoping that will be kind of the recurring date over for the following kind of seminar series. It'll be online, obviously, and there's a Zoom link. I'm just gonna, I hope you don't mind, Jemima and Jessica, I'm just gonna send it via chat so people can kind of go straight to it, hopefully. So yeah, it will be via Zoom again. It will be exactly the same format as these past seminar series organised by Jessica and Jemima. And the first theme, well, the title of this first seminar is Rewriting the Clinic in Contemporary French Women's Writing, Linda Lay and Catherine Malabou, or Catherine Malabou if you want me. Yeah, French. And I'll be giving a paper on Linda Lay, looking at her two short auto-fictional text, War in Crise and Lettres Mortes, and looking at the representation of the psychiatric hospital, a sort of a kind of pejorative and negative representation of the psychiatric hospital. And then Ben will be looking at Catherine Malabou and looking at a more positive kind of affirmative representation or possibility for kind of a clinical space. So yeah, I think that's it. Kind of the title, the date, the time, the theme, and yeah. And if you're interested, like Ben said, in giving a paper, then please, yeah, feel free to email us. And I can pop actually the email address here in the chat. And then yeah, if you have any questions or even just questions about the seminars, feel free to email us or email the IMLR directly. Okay, I think that's it. The spiel is over.
So much. We're really looking forward to this. So hopefully we'll see you all there on the 22nd. I just want to reiterate that if anybody has got some fantastic ideas for a seminar series, even if it's just an idea at this stage, please fire it at us and we'll help out as much as we can to put that together. So a huge thank you to everybody again that's been attending these seminars. A huge thank you to my co-host Jemima. And thank you all just so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. We'll hope to see you all on the 22nd. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.